there are a few companies that are as sort of bought into the idea of U.S.-China relations being fairly warm. And that goes back decades. When you talk about Tim Cook, where did he come from before he was CEO of Apple? He was essentially the architect of this supply chain, the supply chain that relies on these big outsourcers, most of them operating factories in China to manufacture phones, and relies on a market, a market that has grown, tremendously and has done really well by Apple over the past few years. You might have thought during the Trump presidency, Trump, a lot of anti-China rhetoric, a lot of rhetoric about globalization. Apple did great. And one of the reasons Apple did great is because although the trade war did not affect Apple, it did affect Apple's competitors, primarily Huawei. Mm-hmm. So for several years, Huawei was essentially frozen out of the market for high-end chips. It had, in 2019, Huawei actually surpassed Apple in terms of handset sales globally, in terms of units sold. And then it basically fell off a cliff because it lost access to semis, to the high-end semis. And what happened last year is that Huawei, basically out of nowhere, and we've talked about this before, launched this new phone, the Mate 60 Pro, that has a chip that is, although it's not quite a state-of-the-art chip, it's a lot closer than it was. That phone has sold very well. Huawei is bouncing back, and that is creating problems for Apple in China at the same time that the Chinese government is introducing new restrictions that the U.S. has characterized as retribution for our own restrictions. China has been sort of opaque about what they're doing, but it seems like, according to Bloomberg reporting, that many Chinese workers at state-backed companies are being encouraged or told or required not to bring iPhones to work. So you have these two sources of pressure. One is competition, the other is government regulation, and they're biting Apple, in a very important market.
Max, I think a big part of this story also is the fact that the ecosystem, the mobile ecosystem in China, is not as sticky as the mobile ecosystem in other parts of the world. So here in the US, if you're an iOS or an iPhone user, your next phone is going to be an iPhone because you're like in that ecosystem. You have all the apps. But then in China, you have these over-the-top payments apps that work equally well, whether you use an Android or whether you use an iOS device. We don't have that. They don't have that stickiness that we have here with like iMessage and other parts of the Apple ecosystem.
Well, and a big point, when you think about what is appealing about an iPhone, obviously part of it is the hardware. It's very beautiful, works fast, good chip, so on. But the software part is important also. And of course, software in China and these cloud services are regulated differently. Chinese users may not have access to all of the cloud services that US users have access to. So that's another factor. And of course, there's been a lot of sort of media coverage around this issue. In China, there's talk of sort of patriotic duty to buy, phones made by domestic companies, just as there is, I guess, to some extent, in the U.S. But until recently, that hasn't had much of an impact. And one reason it hasn't had much of an impact is because you haven't had really strong competitors. But now, talking to analysts and so on, the competitors are getting better. They're closing that gap with Apple. At a time when the government may be more interested. The government has long been interested in sort of reducing the, influence of foreign-made technology equipment, but where the government now seems to be sort of doing something, acting on that interest.